them how easy it is to get in and create a request and what that looks like and how we're able to use some of that data that does come from the Sage product.
Fantastic. Um, Jesse, often it's much easier just to show in while we're running through a demo. So let's
Yeah.
actually do that. What I've got open at the moment is my web application. And as you saw beforehand, we had the mobile UI as well. Often for demos, it's a bit easier typing on. I've got fat fingers, so typing on a keyboard is somewhat easier than my screen. But when we open the Fraxion app, whether it's in the mobile or the web environment, depending on the configuration, we have a number of modules that are available for us. And depending on the roles that we have assigned to us, we have got some additional functionality in the solution. And we can buy directly from here, or we have these quick purchase buttons. I'm just going to go the sort of slightly long-winded way. Here we can see all the requests that I've submitted, what their state is, when and when they were last modified. Today we're going to focus really on just creating a requisition. So let's buy something. And Fraxion allows you to create requests in a free format way for either goods or services from a product catalog of some kind or from a punch out capability. And punch out, Jesse, is what you were talking about a little bit earlier. Depending on the configuration of the system, depending on whether you have a Staples account, an Amazon account, this allows us directly from the application to navigate through to, for instance, Amazon in this example that we're using, where Amazon recognizes that this is a customer X's implementation of our spend management solution, and says, okay, do you have an Amazon business account, etc. In this case, I'm not going to really demo, but it takes you directly through, and you can select items from Amazon and select them, choose them, add them through to your requisition. Same for a catalog, and then same for free format requests. I'm going to just demonstrate with the free format, which is the most complex way of achieving this goal. So perhaps we're going to buy a laptop. It's the most common thing we use for demos. We identify when we require the item, how many we require. Maybe this one's $400. From which vendor we're going to buy the requisition. Now, obviously, if we use punch out and we ended up going with Amazon, then Amazon would be the pre-populated vendor here. What the approval routing is.
And those vendors that you had there, Stan, where are those coming from? Are those coming from the Sage system?
Correct. This is the first point of integration between ourselves and Sage 100. So the data we need to populate a requisition, including vendors, including GL codes, including the budgets associated with those GL codes, is all sourced from Sage 100. Included in that would be things like the tax schedules, the locations, etc. The approval or authorization writing is obviously something we do internally. So I can send things on a complex approvals route. These are just some of the examples that I've set up, an automatic approval or different approval groups that mimic typically departments, cost centers, or important drivers in the approval structure. And we've got a very, very robust approval process that allows multiple levels of approval at different dollar thresholds. We can have groups of approvals. We can have approvals by line items. So each line item can go to a different approver. So very powerful from that perspective. Where the goods need to be delivered to. Obviously, these default from an employee profile that we store. And then if there's a need at this point to be able to allocate the costs associated with this transaction or this line item, we can do so. If we don't do it during the requisition level, then we certainly have to do it during the invoicing level prior to feeding that transaction back into Sage 100. And the flexibility of the system means that we're not only constrained to the GL codes or the cost allocation structures that come from within Sage 100, but for instance, if we want to say, hey, I want to associate this with a particular customer project and have a project-oriented approval or authorization. Or not only do I want it associated with a project or customer or a job, I want any other cost allocation approvals. Those are completely supported within the system. So it gives us a very powerful way of reporting afterwards. And the beauty is depending on if you've configured allocations or GL codes during requisitions, and you allow the user to have a look at what those approvals or authorizations are. You can see we can save it here. We can then, this one I've actually sent in a state of approval already. We can have a look at what the financial impact is. So we can see consumables, we don't have a budget, but for this particular customer, we have a budget. We can see that we've got $120,000. We spent $2,500, we've got 117 available. So it can be configured to ensure that the person submitting the requisition has got all the necessary information and insight before they raise the requisition, and obviously during the approval process, the same information is available. So it can be very useful from that perspective. And Jesse, that was reasonably complex in terms of sort of structures, but we can mimic a, sorry, I don't know, unfortunately my screen has disappeared here. I'll show in a later stage. But all that information, the ability to raise a requisition, to capture a requisition, is also available in the application, in the mobile environment, and that can be a very powerful feature as well.
Well, and one of the other things that you can do there, and people would notice at the bottom, but you can actually drag and drop any of the attachments that you want, or take a picture off your mobile phone and add that into this. So when people are going to look at those approvals, they can see all the different pieces. So let's say you've got a schematic you want to show, you've got a picture you want to show of a receipt, whatever it might be, all that's available to you there. And it's just drag and drop and away you go. Now, one of the things, and I know Stanton, this is really early in the process, but you did talk about Amazon there. And so I thought
Yeah.
um, there's a new technology coming out. What we've talked about is punch out. And Jeremy, I don't know if you've heard about this recently. Have you heard about punch in? So you're on mute there, Jeremy.
Apologize. No, I've not heard of punch in. Can you give me the 2 cents?
Yeah. So
Oops.
just last week, Stanton and I actually met with Amazon as one of their preferred partners, and were asked to participate in a program where you're going to see a different way of purchasing, where people actually start in, say, their Amazon business account, and when they go and make the purchase, instead of it saying, check out, it'll actually say submit for approval. They'll push submit for approval, and it will directly enter into our system, which is what happens now. But you start with inside of Fraxion. In the punch in scenario, you could start in Amazon and just punch it in. And so we're going to be on the beta partner side of that. But it's certainly a new technology that people probably want to keep their ears and eyes open for going forward. I'm sure it's a year or two away from really general availability and acceptance, but we're pretty proud as Fraxion to be included in Amazon's inner circle on that and be part of their beta program and getting that out there. So it is something that to keep your ears open for and to be listening for, because it's going to change some of the way that people are buying and then the way things are happening out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just doing the same thing but opposite way, starting there and throwing it in versus starting in Fraxion and going out, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it adds some convenience to that. It's quite a powerful feature because what it means is you don't have to have logged into Fraxion firstly. You don't have to have an active session or a requisition that you're creating and say, because the process at the moment is, once you're in Fraxion, we say we want to buy something, and then we have some options in terms of populating that requisition, whether it's going to be an Amazon punch out, a Staples, or Granger. In this environment, independent, Fraxion doesn't have to be open. A user logs into Amazon, and based on their identification, it's associated with their Fraxion account. So they shop as per normal, and when they go check out their cart, they've got an option to automatically create a requisition within Fraxion, route it for approval, and once it's been approved in Fraxion, then it'll automatically release those goods. So that's a very, very powerful feature.
Yeah, and
Great.
it's super fun to be on the front side of that. Obviously, Amazon's leading the charge on that. But yeah, from a customer perspective on your side, being able to see what's coming down the pipe earlier than normal is always fun to talk about. And as the technology gets better, it's super fun.
Very cool. So the next question that comes up, and you hit upon it a little bit, Stan, is the approval process. You talked about approvals in general. Maybe my manager has to approve my purchases, and then if it's over a certain dollar value, that maybe goes up to the VP, or maybe goes through both rungs of that ladder before approval happens. how do those approvals get sent out? Are they via email? Is it a dashboard? Is it a text message? You know, what's the way that people can approve purchases or requests?
So, before I answer that question, I just sort of hone in a little bit, because approvals and authorizations is the core of what our solution is. So we have a very powerful concept of workflows and approvals. Workflows allow us to deal with the process flow of a particular requisition. It may, for instance, have a mechanism where you want pre-approval. Let me show you what that would physically look like in a product like Fraxion. And here's our workflow builder. And it says, well, after we create, we're going to submit it for approval. We're going to do it for purchasing. We have some options on purchasing, whether we're going to automatically create a purchase order, whether we want to consolidate multiple requisitions into an order. So Fraxion has the ability to define what we call these workflows. Within that, there's approval structures within the workflows. And let's choose one. Here's the one that I think we were going to demonstrate, where you can restrict these approval flows to certain request types if you wish. And then we build up an approver list where you can have, here we can see 3 approvers at a certain level and a secondary approver. And typically there's a dollar threshold. In this case, $250 is the limit at which this person can approve or authorize, at which point it'll escalate to the next level. And so this is how we build a complex process workflow and the approval structures associated with that process flow. And we can have some great features like allowing certain managers, for instance, to edit the cost allocation fields, because often when we enable users to create their own allocations, they incorrectly allocate. So we can correct that during the approval process. And then depending on what the desired device is that an individual is using, they'll get a note to approve something in their the web application itself, like we have here. That presupposes that your web application is open. You'll receive a notification in your mobile application as well that tells you that you need to approve or authorize. So if you've got, and your preferred device is in mobile, you'll get that. In addition, we provide an email, a structured email that goes out to the user that informs them that there's a request that they have to approve or authorize, and directs them directly to the request so they can have a look at this request. And we can see what the approval or authorization workflow is. We can see in this particular one, there's 2 people that can potentially approve. They haven't approved. This is a demo environment, and we can see they haven't approved for 155 hours, so that's not great. And as a result, you can notice there's an alert in this particular request, and that's because the approval has been delayed beyond a predetermined time. So not only do we provide the automation flow to take a requisition as quickly through a structured approval, but if there are delays at all, then we notify people of these delays in a real-time environment.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love is the notification piece. And the one part you didn't show there, Stanton, that is actually a newer part for us is the status bar in there that lets you know what's going on. But because there's multiple notifications, people should know what's going on. But if there isn't, be able to say, listen, we need to set up an alert or a notification that says, and this is where we eliminate bottlenecks. So if something's been sitting in a requisition state for too long, we can start sending out notifications saying, hey, something's wrong. Why isn't this being approved? And this is the new status bar that we've just released in our last release that I think people are going to love because it shows exactly what's going on. Stan, why don't you tell us about that one?
Yeah, let me choose a request that's actually a bit further down the line, and let me just search for one that's in a sort of closed state. It'll give you an idea about just how powerful this is. So here's a request that's actually gone through an entire process. It's now closed. And a closed purchase request for us is one that's been converted into a purchase order. It's been fully received. The matching's been resolved if there were any problems, and it's been exported back into Sage 100. And often people during the process want to query the status of that request, and we try to create the sort of self-serve component. So we tell them when it's been submitted. We tell them when it's been submitted for approval and to whom it's gone for approval. In this case, it's already been approved, and we can see the audit trail around the approval here. In this case, it was automatic approval. We can see that it's been purchased, and when it was purchased, we can see the purchase order number if we wish, and we can drill down into the purchase order to see the details associated with that particular request. We can see when it was received, and we can see that it's been closed out as this environment. So from a user perspective, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that especially when you've got a centralized purchasing, is that the person wanting the goods or services isn't always the person who is able to place the order, and certainly isn't always the person who receives those items. And so it's often very important to provide that feedback mechanism, and we do so by way of emails, but also as people sort of want to have a self-service environment, to provide them with the tools so they can see exactly where the request is and where it's backlogged, if it is backlogged.
So that interface is available to the creator of the process or the request to say where are all my requests at in the lineup or in the status of the lifespan.
Correct. So we always provide a view, and here you can see the work center where all my requests are sitting, what the various states are, who they're sort of sitting with at the moment, and what the costs are. So we do provide that at a glance, but often it's slightly more nuanced. You want to be able to see exactly where it's gone, who's got it, and this is what the status bar is, to provide much more detailed insight into the status of that request.
Yeah, one of the parts that our people really like is the approval. So they've sent it off, and when I hover over that approval, it shows me who my next approver is. So if
Correct.
I'm not getting action, I
Yeah.
actually know who it should be going to, and I can reach out and say, "Hey, what have I done wrong, or what's going on? Why aren't you approving my stuff?"
Yeah.
So when I'm doing my expenses, I can always look at it and say, "Hey, Stanton, I traveled here. When am I getting my stuff?" And because I submitted that 2 minutes ago. 2 minutes.
It's been 2 minutes. That's probably the Jesse alert right there, telling me that I
That's
need to
right.
approve it automatically. But yeah, it's a very powerful feature, and it goes towards that ethos of high personalization, empowering the individual to be able to access the information they need to make the best buying decisions on behalf of the company.
Like you said, that's the work engine of your solution, definitely the cornerstone, and looks nice and flexible and easy to manage. So that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So I think what the next part of the process is, now I've set the request in, it's approved, and a PO is created, especially in a procurement standpoint. That definitely is the case. Maybe not. Maybe you can talk about expense reports being a little bit different. I'm not sure that creates a PO, but a PO is created. Does that PO stay within Fraxion? Does it go to Sage 100? Those are a couple questions we've had, and can you talk about the PO process once that request is approved?
Yeah, so we seem to see from a purchase order process two separate schools of thought. The one is typically for large organizations, an element of what we call central purchasing. In other words, that request is then sent through to someone who has a role of a buyer in an organization. And I think in this demonstration, I have this user as a buyer. And here you can see as a user, we can work by company. We can look at various requests that have been fully approved and authorized that I can convert into a purchase order. So this is a strongly centralized environment. Here I can say, well, I've actually got two requests to the supplier. We can sort by supplier. So I can say, well, I want to look at this particular supplier ABC, and I can see that I've got a number of requests that have been approved for the supplier. I can select multiple ones and consolidate them into a single order. Or if I choose just the one, I can go ahead and I can create an order. I can give a once over, add any kind of comments that I want to be able to have, and click the purchase. That allows me then to have an electronic document that I can email automatically. This picks up the email from the vendor master file, and we can send this email directly to a particular vendor. And there's a very nicely structured email, looks really attractive, and there's a PDF document that represents the particular order. And this process itself is typical of what larger organizations run in a fairly centralized environment. Here's a copy of what that order looks like and the terms and conditions associated with it. This is also a potential integration point into Sage where we can post purchase orders. Our most common integration into Sage 100, however, is not purchase orders, but rather the invoices associated with purchase orders. And so that's another integration point as well. In some environments where we configure the workflow, and this supports a more decentralized environment, is that once approval or authorization has taken place on that requisition, it automatically converts that into a purchase order and automatically emails that to the vendor and advises you that that email has been automatically generated and created. That's typical of small organizations or ones that need to be fairly nimble in terms of turnaround times. And while that's super helpful, because essentially there's just a purchase requisition approval, once it's approved, it flips it into a purchase order for you, it loses the opportunity to consolidate requisitions. So that's the only flip side around automatic purchase order conversion in a sort of decentralized environment. But both of those options are available to customers.
Yeah, and most of the ones that we've talked to you about, Jeremy, are more that decentralized purchasing, and that's that client base more what you're probably seeing in that Sage 100 area.
And receipt of, if we're pushing the PO to Sage, receipt of goods and receipt of invoice are done within Sage, or are they done in Fraxion and then updated within Sage? Can you talk through that process?
Yeah, so there's actually 3 integration points that are available with Prime. The first is, in some cases, for some customers, requisitions, once they're approved, are populated into the underlying accounting system. Then the scenario that we spoke about now is that if purchase order integration is required, then as you correctly point out, receipting and the invoicing matching process takes place within Sage. The most common use case that we have, though, and I'd say probably 80 or 90% of our customers fit into this category, is where Fraxion generates the purchase order. There is no integration at that point into Sage, but we do the full accrual accounting in terms of the budget drawdowns, so that people are 100% aware that there is this deducted amount from the budget associated with the open order. We do the receipting within our application, and the receipting is fairly simple, but it can be powerful. We can measure supplier performance, we can capture images, we can capture receipts, we can identify if there's a receipt issue associated with it. We can track in delivery references, or if it's a URL from a system like Amazon, we can populate it there. And then invoice matching takes place within Fraxion as well. And once it's been fully matched, we integrate it at the AP level. So that bill, that invoice is integrated into Sage 100. So those are the two scenarios that we most frequently encounter, with AP integration or invoice integration being the most popular by far.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead.
Visibility of quantity on hand and quantity on order and quantity on sales order, if you're going to that level, that would push that over to, say, push the PO to Sage. But if you're not looking for that type of information from a sales standpoint, then keeping it in Fraxion probably makes the most sense.
Absolutely, and that's probably the biggest differentiator. Most non-stock, non-inventory items would be completely done in Fraxion, the invoice passed across at the end.
And that's also actually how we differentiate between the two products that we do, is depending on if they're looking to purchase the inventory or not. And what we're seeing in our cloud-based solution is really that indirect spend that isn't related to your inventory or resale piece there. So that is one of the big differentiators.
Got it. And then the data stays in Fraxion, and documents can be attached, and all that information stays in Fraxion in the cloud, and then we're just pushing the invoice information over to AP.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yes.
And one of the big drivers, I mean, you've already built a system that, because you don't want people in your accounting system and then saying to them, well, you're probably, a lot of those same people ordering or doing the receiving, and now you're also giving them access to your accounting system to do receiving. They just want one streamlined process in one place to make it happen. At the end, you have that intervention of the accounting team to say, okay, yeah, it's approved, here it is, we're going to make that payment. And so really keeping all those people in one place with a very smooth and efficient process with huge visibility and auditability, that's the key driver of where they go with this, and then do that integration that Stan was talking about at the invoice level.
And one major difference between, I know we're kind of answering a couple of our questions in one fair swoop, but definitely one of the questions that we have that is definitely a differentiator between Prime and eRequester is the local install versus the web install. And Frac, can you talk to us about that infrastructure, where does Fraxion live, and what sort of element needs to be installed on the server to integrate it to Sage 100?
That's a great question, and if I could deal with the integration afterwards, because that is slightly different. So the Fraxion app, as you have alluded to, is a pure cloud-based solution. So we sit on top of the Microsoft Azure platform, and we have multiple data centers. The primary data centers are either reside in the US or Western Europe. So depending on your customer's tolerance for sort of control and access, most US customers feel that the US is the best place, and most European customers, as you can imagine, feel Europe is the best place for that data to reside. So we have that as one of the choices. Choosing Microsoft Azure platform was really a relatively easy decision for us, because we wanted to provide high levels of security, making sure that the data platform itself is SOC compliant, and in some cases is government approved. And there's a specific certification process called FedRAMP certification for public sector organizations that require very, very high degrees of control and authentication. And that was our primary motivation for looking at Microsoft Azure as the platform. So the application and the data set associated with that is ring-fenced to a particular territory, as I said, either Western Europe or the US. Now, that data consists of what information we need to pull from Sage 100 to be able to create a request. We spoke about vendors, we spoke about GL accounts, we spoke about actuals and budget data. We also have a spend analytics platform on top of this that's also based on the Microsoft Power BI data infrastructure, and that allows us very sophisticated analytics and reporting on the data. And once again, that's ring-fenced to the region or the territory that you operate in. But it does create some interesting challenges for a non-cloud-based ERP system like Sage 100. So to resolve that issue, Fraxion has a software tool called Connect. And Connect, in effect, acts as a bridge between an on-prem application and the cloud-based application. So there's a small agent that Connect loads on the same network or has access to the Sage 100 server. And it acts as a shepherd of data backwards and forwards between the cloud, our cloud-based system, and Sage 100, where it integrates at a sort of fairly, I think it uses some of the COM objects. I'm not 100% sure specifically for the Sage 100, but it is a very powerful and secure feature. It batches information from Sage that needs to go to our cloud solution and vice versa. So it's sitting in the background, moving data and chaperoning that data across to make sure it gets across, dealing with the error messaging and error resolutions if there are any for that data. But it's powerful and slick. It does mean, however, that it's not true real-time integration. We don't really see that as a problem. Typically, we batch transactions and they move across every couple of minutes. So there is the possibility that if there's 20 transactions to a particular budget, and they're all happening simultaneously, that the data Fraxion has visibility maybe out by a minute or two, but practically we've never seen that as a concern. So that's how we handle that sort of data migration or transfer between cloud and on-prem systems. And we've got some great white papers and videos that we can make available to your team to show you how that operates in real life and what the implications are. But from our perspective, very smooth and trouble-free.
Yeah, and if you, sorry, go ahead, Jeremy. Yeah.
I was just saying the footprint all said and done is pretty small. That's I mean, from a standpoint of someone in a Sage 100 world, they don't need to invest in a big platform to make this happen. It's a small connector that pushes data back and forth between the two solutions, and that's
correct. It's a minuscule footprint, and in fact, we've further optimized it so we only do a diff of the data. So the delta, in other words, a changed information, is the only thing that moves across on the internet. So not only is the footprint incredibly small, it's a little SQL DB that's installed. That's a couple of meg. The data that moves across is relatively trivial because it's only the differential.